Good morning, everybody. I've been fighting allergies this week, so if I get a little froggy and have to take a break to take a sip of coffee this morning, bear with me. I'm Jaime Robb, and I manage the Office of Stormwater Management for DEQ. I've been with DEQ for about 20 years now, worked in various programs, including the Air Division program, as well as the VPDES permitting program. And Dan asked me to come up today to talk a little bit about some of the stuff we've got going on at the agency, specifically touching on the 2019 construction general permit. Is everybody online able to hear me while y'all get that?
If you stand over here, they'll hear you better. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So first, let me say that I drove up from Richmond today. I'm centered at our DEQ headquarters in Richmond. And I had the most pleasurable drive to Northern Virginia I've ever had in my life. And that had a lot to do with the fact that I got off on 17 and came country roads all the way up. That being said, beautiful part of the state up here. I haven't been too much of Northern Virginia past like the main part where 95 runs in. So one of the So the first thing I'm going to talk about is going to be the permit, and then I'm going to touch on some of the other activities that DEQ has going on right now, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. Just out of curiosity of the folks in the room, how many of you are with the local government? Oh, good. So you guys, this should be old hat to you guys. What about the development community? Okay, a few engineers and consulting. Okay, so we've got a real good mix here today. For those with the local governments, if you sat through our CGP webinar, I apologize. You're going to see a lot of stuff that looks very familiar. But that being said, our construction general permit is a regulation. So what happens is that regulation is set for a 5-year period of time. And the current general permit became effective July 1, 2014 and expires June 30, 2019. So what that means is about 18 months prior to expiration, DEQ has to begin a regulatory process to update the permit so that we'll have a permit in place by the time the old one expires. As part of that regulatory process, what we do is we put out a notice letting folks know, hey, DEQ's getting ready to engage in this regulatory action. We ask for volunteers to be part of a technical advisory committee. We form that committee, and then folks meet, talk about the old permit, what's working, what's not, what needs to be updated, what changes need to be made in response to changes in the EPA federal construction general permit. And then ultimately we take a general permit to our board, the State Water Control Board, as proposed. We go out for public comment for 60 days. We hold 1 or more hearings. And then we take all of the comments that we received, make adjustments if we feel necessary, and then take the permit back to our board for final approval. So with this general permit, we had a technical advisory committee that was made up of several local governments, some state agencies, some environmental organizations, and as well as some industry reps. We had a rep from the Home Builders Association and the Manufacturers Association. So that TAC worked very hard. They endured a lot of discussion on very technical details related not to just the general permit, but how that general permit works with our Virginia Stormwater Management Permit regulation, and ultimately came up with a proposed permit. And that permit was approved by our Water Control Board on April 15th. Unfortunately, due to some other agency projects that were going on, we fell behind on our schedule. We would have liked to have had that approved around the first of the year, and it would have given us all a little bit more time to finalize forms, answer questions, issue guidance, all of the stuff that comes along with the regulation. So the big question, who needs to apply for a permit? And I think that most folks in here know that the construction general permit applies to those land disturbing activities that are 1 acre or greater, or less than an acre and part of a common plan of development or sale. So as far as the reissuance is concerned, any existing operator that will continue to engage in land disturbing activities after July 1, 2019 will need to reapply for coverage if they haven't already. And Yes, that is even if they just got their permit. So we're still processing 2014 permits, folks coming in wanting to start, their construction activities as soon as possible. They've got to have that 2014 permit because the new permit doesn't become effective till July 1, 2019. So that's a question a lot of folks don't understand. And that's why I gave a little bit of the background about the 5-year period of time. And that's 5 years. That's a set 5-year for every permit holder. And then the other category would be of those that need to apply for reissuance are those that are not eligible for termination yet. And if you're familiar with their permit, you know that there are provisions regarding permit termination that talk about transfer of ownership, coverage under another state permit, or the project is finished, it's been stabilized, everything's wrapped up in a nice tidy bow, and you submit your documentation to DEQ or your VSMP authority. And most folks hopefully know that in Virginia, 5 years ago, we switched to a format in which many of our local governments act as partners with DEQ in processing these permit requests. They're doing plan review for both erosion and sediment control and post-construction stormwater management. They're processing registration statements. They're processing notice of terminations. So we work very closely with those local government reps. And then one more thing, just to, as a reminder for folks, with the reissuance, there is no fee, and that is a pure reissuance. Whatever you currently have permitted, you'll get a reissuance for. If there's a need to do a transfer of ownership or to, let's say you're increasing your acreage of disturbance, that needs to be done as a separate permit action. One, there are fees associated with that. Modifications are going to likely have plan reviews associated with that. So for reissuance only, there's no fee, and whatever you've got permitted in the 2014 permit is what is going to get rolled over into that 2019 permit. All right, so I'm going to go through some of the higher level changes. If you looked at a markup copy of the general permit, it might look like a lot changed. I promise it isn't that much that's changed. Excuse me. We did some reorganization. We tried to clarify and clean up where we could. Just a minute, please. Excuse me again. And so here we're just going to highlight a few of those changes. The first change has to do with the definition of final stabilization. And in the previous permit, it spoke to situations of residential construction when the project was finished and turned over to a homeowner. Excuse me, I apologize. And that home builder had to notify the new homeowner about the importance of final stabilization. But the home builder only had to take the project through temporary stabilization. So what we changed with this definition was to require that home builder or operator to provide that notification about final stabilization in writing to the new homeowner and basically sign a certification statement that that information was provided. All right, so most of the changes probably revolve around the registration requirements and the permit termination requirements. One of the new requirements is that a site map needs to be provided, and that does not need to be a full plan sheet. That can be an 8.5 by 11 sheet that's downloaded from a topograph or Google image. Basically outlining the limits of disturbance, showing construction entrances, and a few other things. If it is a new request coming in, the VSMP authority can choose to use site maps associated with the plans that are submitted, but we are asking that for reissuances, a site map be included. So there's a little discretion there on the VSMP authority's part. There is a program, and some of you all may or may not be aware of this, but in Virginia, in the stormwater regs and the ENS regs, Certain entities such as state agencies, federal entities, and certain private entities such as linear projects, water utilities, transmission utilities, they are allowed to create what I like to refer to as a faux VSMP authority. So they provide, put together a program that's consistent with our regulations and laws. DEQ reviews and approves that. And then they can do their own plan review. They do their own inspections, and then DEQ has oversight of those projects. So that we call that the annual standard inspect program. And a lot of times we'll get requests for permit coverage. That's the one thing that they can't do, is we get those requests for permit coverage for projects under annual standards and specs. And we have created a form now that we ask folks to submit when their projects are covered under that program. A biggie that we added this go round is an erosion and sediment control plan approval date for existing permittees. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but essentially starting in the 2014 permit, there was a requirement that new permit coverage had to have an approved ENS plan and approved post-construction stormwater management plan prior to getting permit coverage. And this is a little different than the way permit coverage was given under the 09 permit in previous iterations of the permit, and was in response to some comments that we had gotten from EPA and just overall, good practices. Because when we issue you a permit, a state permit, which is also a federal permit, that is giving you permission to land disturb, you really should have all of those plans in place. Let's see, we're asking for folks to indicate whether or not their land disturbance has commenced for those that had previous permit coverage. We're also asking for a letter of availability for nutrient credits, and that would apply to new issuances if the operator will be buying credits to meet its post-construction stormwater requirements. Those were the big changes in the permit coverage portion of the regulation. Under the permit termination requirements, most everything stays the same. And if you've ever applied for termination to DEQ, these are probably not new things that you've seen for the most part, but we've added them to the permit. So, I've referenced the Virginia Stormwater Management Permit Regulation, and that's what we refer to as our base reg. That's what houses all of the regulatory requirements associated with post-development stormwater management and VSMP authorities. And in that regulation, it requires construction record drawings to be provided at the conclusion of a project, as well as have a B&P maintenance agreement that is executed with the local government court land records. So we have added those items to the termination requirements. And then in addition, I mentioned about that stabilization, final stabilization definition as it applies to residential construction. With the termination document, we're also asking for that signed certification from operators or home builders that final stabilization importance notification was provided to the new owner in writing. So there were a few changes as it pertained to the language in the permit for TMDLs, impaired waters, and exceptional waters. A lot of the changes streamlined it. If you are familiar with the permit, there was a section, or is a section, that talks about authorization to discharge. And, it laid out in the 2014 permit all of the requirements that if you discharge to one of these types of waters, this is what you have to do. In addition, under the SWIP requirements, those same requirements were repeated. And just in an effort to kind of streamline and clean up the permit, make it a little bit simpler for folks, we removed a lot of that language from the authorization to discharge and just referenced the SWIP portion of the general permit regulation. We also have added, so it's no longer just nutrients and sediment, but if there's an impairment or a TMDL approved prior to the term of the permit, so prior to July 1, 2019, for PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, and the construction activity involves the demolition of structures equal to or greater than 10,000 square feet that were built or renovated prior to January 1, 1980, then you have to abide by those TMDL and impaired water requirements. So the stormwater pollution prevention section of the permit You guys should be pretty familiar with that. It talks about how you manage waste on site, some of the erosion and sediment control requirements. You know, it's broken into 4 sections: general information, erosion and sediment control, post-development stormwater management, and then the pollution prevention plan. That particular section was revised to require that waste containers be covered or closed at the end of each business day and during precipitation events. And if they cannot be closed, there are, you know, alternative methods are acceptable: securing tarps or sheeting, creating a secondary containment around the container, storage under a temporary roof structure. These are all items that were, or this particular item was added for consistency with EPA's 2017 Construction General Permit. So there was a change regarding the SWIP inspection frequencies. I think that the Technical Advisory Committee discussed the previous requirement. And those of you familiar know that the permit contains a couple different inspection frequencies. You can choose to just have a blanket, do an inspection every 5 days, or do an inspection every 4 days if it's to an impaired or exceptional water. Makes life easy. You don't have to worry about rainfall events. You don't have to worry about sending, you know, staff out to sites if the site's unmanned. Then there's the other inspection frequencies if you choose not to take advantage of, I'll call it the more straightforward approach, in which an inspection frequency has to be performed by the operator for the SWIP every 10 days. And in the 2014 permit, it was no later than 48 hours after a measurable storm event. Or in the case of impaired discharge to an impaired water or exceptional water, it was every 5 days and within 24 hours. That requirement has now been changed. It's been changed to no later than 24 hours after a measurable storm event. And this was a change that was made after discussions with the TAC and what was appropriate for really hitting at the environmental concerns associated with those storm events and construction sites. The alternative inspection frequencies, they remain unchanged. Those are still options. Folks can choose to do that if they wish. SWIP inspections. So I will give credit where credit is due. This was a WSSI suggestion, and the TAC agreed that it was a good suggestion, as did DEQ. And we've included a condition in the permit that in cases of adverse weather conditions, that the safety of the inspector is compromised, an operator can perform a SWIP inspection on the next business day that it's safe to do so. So, you know, if we've got an ice storm that hits the area and you're coming up on your, you know, day 5 that you need to do your inspection, and it's unsafe to get out there on that site and be performing that SWIP inspection, this provides a little bit of flexibility. But there does need to be documentation included with the SWIP to identify that the inspection was delayed due to the adverse weather conditions, and then, you know, need to get back out there the first business day that it's safe to do so. One other change that was made related to the SWIP is, I believe the previous permit, folks had 7 days to get out there and update the SWIP to include the most recent inspection report. And we have changed that to 4 days. Part of the rationale for that is that, you know, when our inspectors come out on site, they're looking for the most up-to-date information. Same with the VSMP authorities. I don't think everybody was happy about that. I think that there was some concern that SWIP inspection reports and corrective actions wouldn't be updated to reflect those corrective actions. But from a regulatory perspective, there really shouldn't be that large of a concern with getting that SWIP updated with that inspection report and making those additional changes. So I'm a fast talker, so I don't think I'm going to use my whole 90 minutes, Dan. I'll just tell you that now. I've got some more slides to go through, though. I thought I would just walk through. Those were the big changes in the permit this go round, and I'll talk about process, but I'll just walk through the registration statement because most folks in this room are used to a one-page registration statement. And I don't know how other folks felt about that registration statement. I felt like it was a little clunky just because it was all compact. It was hard to read. It was unclear sometimes what some of the questions were. So we have revised that registration statement, partially to make it more user-friendly, but also partially because the state has been required to update all of its documents to be ADA compliant. This was a federal regulatory requirement a few years ago. And so as we develop new documents, that is a requirement for us. So in the past, we've had one registration statement. So whenever any of you guys have come in to modify a permit or do a transfer of ownership, reissue, whatever the case might be, that one form stood. And typically what we would do is we would write at the top or tell folks to write at the top modification. So we included some sections in the permit or some blocks in the permit where the operator could indicate what the purpose of the registration statement is. So right now we're seeing a lot with reissuance checked. We are seeing some with new issuance checked. And a place to put the permit number, which was on the last form. We've added a new spot for billing information. So DEQ and some VSMP authorities do charge annual billing, annual maintenance bills. And what we have found when we send those bills out is that they don't always get to the right people, because Joe Smith, who might be the president of the company that signs a registration statement, might not be the one that strokes the check for that annual maintenance fee. So we've asked for information regarding the billing contact. We've included, I mentioned the requirement for a site map, construction activity, and construction entrance information. All of that remains unchanged. We've changed a little bit, looks a lot different, but a little bit of the site information blanks. I don't know that it was completely clear on the previous registration statement that off-site estimated areas to be disturbed needed to be included. So what we've done is we've broken it down into 3 acreages that need to be reported on that registration statement. So that's your total development, the primary estimated area to be developed, and the off-site estimated area to be developed. And just to give you an example, let's say that there's a new 25-acre residential development coming in, and maybe it's being broken into 3 phases. And that first phase is only going to be 5 acres. So the total land area of development is going to be 25 acres. Primary estimated area to be disturbed is going to be that first 5 acres. And then if there's any offsite area to be disturbed, that would need to be reported as well. And what we are issuing permit coverage for, just to make it very clear, and this will tie into our discussion about erosion and sediment control plans, is that the primary estimated area to be disturbed, that is what you're getting permit coverage for. So once you finish that 5 and you're ready to move on to that next 10, you got to come back in and get that permit modified, so that now your estimated area to be disturbed is a total of 15. Property owner status, that hasn't changed, nature of construction activity, and whether or not you discharge to an MS4. So this section here addresses the 3 new items that we included for registration coverage as to whether or not an ENS plan has been submitted to the appropriate ENS authority for review, the date of approval. That again is to match the area of estimated disturbance, whether or not land disturbance has commenced, and if someone is applying for permit coverage for a project that had been covered under an annual standard and specification program, the name of that entity with the approved program. One issue that we see a lot on registration statements is that we do not get the right person signing them. And even though the 2014 form included in the instructions who is authorized to sign that form and who we will accept signatures from, we revised the form to this year to include that regulatory language to make it very clear about who has signatory authority for these registration statements. So it looks like a bunch of legal mumbo jumbo, kind of is, but it really is there because we weren't seeing what we needed to on these forms. And then finally, the previous form had DEQ's information on it. So as I mentioned, our VSMP authorities are also reviewing these registration statements, receiving them, reviewing them, and entering them into our database. And it gets a little confusing for folks to know exactly who they need to submit that to. So we've provided a place for VSMP authorities to enter their address or put a stamp or sticker or whatever they need to do to make sure that they get that. So now I'll talk about, we're getting a lot of registration statements in. We've got a lot of experience in the past of old registration statements and just some of the areas where we see problems typically. And that is the first item would be the owner or operator name. So when you're filling out that owner or operator name on the form, it really needs to be the name that is registered with a state corporation commission. That could be a Virginia SCC, that can be North Carolina, Maryland, whoever you're registered with needs to match what you put on that form. And DEQ does verify every single ownership name or owner name that is placed in our database with the appropriate SCC. And we hear people hollering, where's my permit? How come I haven't gotten it yet? And typically it's because there's a problem with that owner name. The next item, estimated area to be disturbed. With the reissuance, it should not change. And there is one exception to that. As I mentioned, whatever permit coverage you got for 2014, you will be getting for 2019, unless you do a modification prior to applying for reissuance. And what we found, I'm sure most folks know, around the 2014 timeframe, when the new stormwater management regulations became effective, there were a lot of folks that applied for permit coverage trying to secure their spot to use the old technical criteria for post-development stormwater management. And when I say a lot, I will tell you, it was close to 4,000 permit applications the department received in the April, May, June timeframe of 2014. So we were processing 2009 permit coverage, all those ones that came in at the last minute to secure that old criteria, as well as new permit coverage. And I don't exactly know where confusion came in, but folks that had not started their construction activity yet, or maybe that they hadn't moved very far down the path of starting their construction activity, they said, oh, I'm gonna, build a industrial development park and I'm gonna disturb 100 acres. So I need 100 acres of estimated area to be disturbed and 100 acres of development. And to be honest, with 4,000 plus applications coming in, there wasn't a whole lot of verification. They were processed and those permits were sent out. Well, that 2014 permit said, if you had an 09 permit and you were reapplying for 2014 permit coverage, we recognize that you may not have had received your erosion and sediment control plan approval at that time, even though it was a permit requirement. So in an attempt to provide some flexibility, the department said you've got 60 days to update your SWIP and submit your erosion and sediment control plan to the appropriate authority. Well, here we are 5 years later. And what we found is, well, I'm not doing 500 acres or 100 acres of disturbance. I'm doing 5 acres of disturbance, or I'm doing 10 acres of disturbance. And they are approved for an estimated area to be disturbed of 100 acres because that's what they told us they were going to do. Like I said, when we give you permit coverage, it's based on that estimated area to be disturbed. So if you're going to be disturbing something, you need to have an erosion and sediment control plan that matches what you're permitted to disturb. And we've told folks, okay, well then you need to get an erosion sediment control plan approved for the 100 acres. And they said, well, wait a minute, that's not what we meant. So in the case, and this is specific, I'm kind of talking to my BSMP authorities here. If that is the case, you've heard from us, never, ever, ever decrease acreage. This is the one time that we will say it is okay. But you got to have that erosion and sediment control plan that matches up with that acreage. So that is just one area to kind of be aware of on that registration statement. We're seeing, and that ties into that no erosion and sediment control plan approval date. A lot of folks did not follow the 2014 permit requirement to submit within 60 days their ENS plan to their local authority. you know, they got to pass on the post-development stuff. We said, just have those calculations, the documentation in your SWIP. We're not going to make you go through approval for that, but you do have to get that ENS approval. And for some reason or another, folks either, one, did not submit the plan to the authority, or two, they submitted it, got comments back, and then felt like that they never needed to proceed to resolve those comments. We are working one-on-one with our local governments on that issue. I will say, if you come to me and say, I don't have an erosion and sediment control plan and Fairfax won't give me a permit, I'm going to tell you, call Fairfax. And then I'm going to have a conversation with Jerry and Brandy, and we'll talk about how to proceed from there. It's not a unique situation. It's something DEQ is currently dealing with as well. But there was an expectation. It was written in the permit. It was written in the coverage letters. I don't really know where the breakdown was on that. I think a lot of folks got scared about the new technical criteria. They wanted the old criteria, and they did whatever they thought they had to do just to preserve that spot under that old stormwater criteria. And, you know, right or wrong, with no intentions of maybe moving forward, and now they're trying to keep that permit coverage and aren't prepared to do that. And then the last item I will mention is we're getting a lot of registration statements with no site map. Again, it's not, it doesn't need to be complex. No offense to my consultants and engineers in here, but it's something that we would accept if someone wanted to print off a Google Earth image and draw their limits of disturbance. It doesn't need to be complicated. It just needs to identify that area of disturbance. And part of that goes back to when since folks didn't have to have stormwater management plan approval when they got their permit from DEQ in 2014 under the old criteria. We don't really know what those limits of disturbance are. We don't know what area was proposed until we get out on site and see the SWIP. And so that's why we're asking that, really tying into what the permit coverage is. All right. So the way that it works, this is the first time that the VSMP authorities have been involved with reissuance. Folks, operators will fill out their registration statements and they will submit it to the VSMP authority. Our and that might be DEQ, but in 95 other local governments, it's going to be the local government's responsibility to review and accept that. The data gets uploaded and entered into the DEQ database. And we've been making changes for those of you that are in here. Hopefully it's going smoothly with that. Trying to get all of that taken care of for this reissuance. DEQ does review every one that gets submitted. That is a big misconception. People think I gave it to the local government, DEQ has to push a button. No, we actually, like I said, we look at the owner operator names, we look at lat longs, making sure it's the right watershed, the right receiving streams. I see you, Jimmy. Let me say this: we verify that the VSMP authority has entered the information correctly, and then we also are verifying whether or not the discharge is into an impaired water or to a exceptional water or to a water with a TMDL for nutrient sediments or PCBs. So, so we are touching those, and that is why it does take a little bit longer. Once we're good to go, if we find a problem and we're the VSMP authority, we reach straight out to the operator or whoever submitted the registration statement, and we usually by email ask them to, hey, correct this on the form or verify this information. If it's a problem with data that the VSMP authority has submitted, we'll go to those folks and say, hey, can you get this squared away for us and let us know when you've taken care of it. Once it's all good to go, we push a button. That's where the button comes in. We do push a button and an email is generated with an attached permit coverage letter, and the VSMP authority is notified. So I should have probably included a copy of what the new coverage letters look like. They have changed. If you're familiar with them, you know that there was a normal approval letter, no TMDLs, no impaired waters, no exceptional waters. And then you discharged an impaired water, you discharged an exceptional water. There was 8 variations of the letter, I think. With the addition of the PCB component, we ended up with 30 different letters. we said, okay, this is a nightmare. When something changes, whether it be the governor or the secretary of natural resources or the agency director, we have to update letterhead or change something in the actual text of the letter. This is going to be a rough one. So we have revised those letters, and it will say, all of them will look identical, and it will say the general information about having permit coverage, and then it'll say, do you discharge to an impaired water for sediment or nutrients? And then based on the information that we have been able to gain from our review, there will be either a yes or a no, followed by, if yes, then here are your requirements. And that'll be one for nutrients and sediment, one for PCBs, and one for exceptional waters. So you need to pay close attention to those approval letters. Make sure you look at that yes, no. If it says yes, you have additional requirements associated with your permit. It should be spelled out in the coverage letter. But regardless, your permit is what covers you. The coverage letter is notification. Your permit is what you need to be abiding by. When will you get your permit? We hear this all the time. So for reissuances, they are a priority, but they are not our number one priority. Like I said, we've got folks coming in trying to get 2014 permit coverage to start land disturbance yesterday, like everyone always wants to do. Those are our primary focus. We don't have a lot of them, but we do have them. And in addition to that, there are currently about 6,000 active 2014 permits that we anticipate will be coming across our desks for reissuance. Again, touching every single one of those. We have 2 full-time permit writers, and they are rock stars, and I cannot ask them to do more than what they've been doing. They have really gone above and beyond, not only in the world of just processing these things and keeping them organized and eliciting the help of other staff members to help keep us going and helping us update the database. So they've got a variety of responsibilities. Plus, like I said, those 2014 permits. So be patient. Folks are used to getting their permit coverage within, it was maybe 5-7 days. Now it's out to about 14 days. For reissuances, we're not abiding by that 14-day time frame because folks don't need that permit coverage until July 1. And there will be some permits that do not get issued prior to July 1, I am speculating, at which point if they submitted a complete registration statement, they're good. They can keep doing what they're doing. They're under what we call administrative continuance. They submitted the 2019 registration statement, and at no fault of their own, the permit is expired and they just haven't gotten that new permit. So we'll work with folks. You don't get any official notification you've been administratively continued, but if you have questions, you certainly can reach out to your VSMP authority and they'll contact us. Or if we're your authority, feel free to contact us. So that is pretty much it on the 2019 reissuance. Needless to say, we've been busy, and that might be an understatement. But that is not my only responsibility at DEQ. So we've got the Construction General Permit Coverage, or Construction General Permit Program that I manage. I also oversee the rest of the construction stormwater world at DEQ. That includes the technical components. So I have a technical specialist. Most of you guys probably have heard of Robert Cooper. Very knowledgeable guy. He is our go-to when there's questions about some of the BMP specifications, the engineering, other questions about a site, or site-specific questions. And the way that we operate at DEQ is our regional offices do the plan review. They're the ones also that are in the field doing the compliance inspections. And then if they're dealing with a plan and a question comes up, hey, what is this water quantity requirement, or does this demonstrate compliance with our water quantity requirements? Robert is working one-on-one with our regional offices. So I know some folks like to reach out to Robert specifically, and some folks have relationships with him. I would encourage you to continue to work through your regional office if you're trying to get plans approved. It just makes the process a whole lot smoother on our end. In addition to the technical components, we also issue guidance regarding plan review, oversee ENS and post-development stormwater, and then any type of stormwater regulatory work. So other DEQ stormwater news, starting next week, we are conducting 4 outreach sessions to our VSMP authorities. And not to make everybody else not feel special, but it is specifically to speak with just our VSMP authorities about how program implementation is going. It's been 5 years since the program rolled out to them. We know that there's still challenges. We know that, you know, there's some great success stories that could help other localities. And we're going to be going out to the Hampton Roads area, Northern Virginia area, Lexington, and Richmond, and having some one-on-one conversations with those guys that hopefully will result in a smoother program implementation for everyone involved. So VSMP authorities, if you haven't seen my latest email, be on the lookout. Try and think of successes, challenges you're having. One challenge, I'll say that DEQ, this is an example I love to give, a challenge that we continue to have 5 years later is a post-development construction stormwater plan review usually requires 4 resubmittals. So we get the initial plan, and then our staff reviews it, sends it back, and that's going on multiple times. And I don't know, you know, personally, I don't know how and what the issue is. How do we fix it? What the issue is? We do have some designers that will use DEQ as a QA/QC of their own work, or that's what it at least appears to be. We have some that just try to see what they can slip through, trying to save their client the most money. And I think that that's part of it, but it continues to be an issue. So that's something, you know, I want to hear if VSMP authorities are having the same problem, and, you know, has anyone figured out a way to get around it? So those are the conversations we'll have next week with our VSMP authorities. In addition to that, we have kicked off the regulatory process for the consolidated regulation. In 2016, the General Assembly passed the consolidated legislation that combined the erosion and sediment control programs and the stormwater management program. And what that resulted in was the Virginia Erosion and Stormwater Management Act. And this is going to be real interesting. So for the past 5 years, we've had local governments that are acting as a ENS authority, as they have been for almost 40 years. They are also acting as the Stormwater Management Authority. And then we've got local governments that are just doing ENS, and DEQ's doing the stormwater management. And then we've got situations for federal and state projects in which DEQ is both the ENS and the Stormwater Authority. So we end up with the VSCP, VSMP, and VESMP programs. And this regulatory process, the legislation basically directed DEQ to develop regulations to make the programs consistent. We know that there's some inconsistencies between the ENS program and the stormwater program, and we need to fix those consistencies. We need to look at program administration, because there are some options in there for local governments that might not want to take on the challenge of plan review, but they do, you know, have a vested interest in being on the ground and doing the inspection for stormwater. So we have our first meeting of our regulatory advisory panel June 18th. And that is a public meeting. Anyone is eligible to attend. We have 25 panel members, mostly made up of local government and local government representation. And the reason for that is that this regulatory process is going to be administrative intensive. So it's going to be about program administration, not technical criteria. We're not changing minimum standards. We're not changing post-development quantity criteria or quality criteria or how you comply via offsite. Those are off the table. And the reason that those are off the table is because the General Assembly directed us to do this and gave us an exempted process, which means we don't have to go to the governor's office for a regulatory review. It's kind of a fast track approach. And the only way we can do that is if we stick strictly to program administration requirements. The agency is currently looking at our manufacturer treatment device guidance. We issued back in 2015, I think. It was an interim guidance to get us through. the stormwater regulations and the Stormwater Management Act basically advises DEQ that for proprietary treatment devices, we need to have a process in place to approve those. And we put something in place a few years back. It has worked as a stopgap. It was meant to be interim. And what we have found over the past few years is that we've had a little bit of creep into the program as far as, what may or may not or should not have been approved. We've got situations of reciprocity with other states. And what does that mean when they have different levels of approval? Does DEQ accept a conditional approval, or are we only accepting final approval and reciprocity? So we have drafted up a guidance document. We have shared that with our BMP Clearinghouse committee. We have also shared that with the local governments. And it's more of just a starting point to get feelers out. We're a little unsure how this process is going to go because in the 2018 General Assembly, legislation was passed that said if DEQ or any state agency issues guidance, it's got to go on the street for public comment for 30 days. And if we receive comments to the effect that it's bordering on regulatory development and not just clarification or program implementation items, then we've got to take a hard look as to whether or not we need to start a regulatory process or not. So MTDs are tricky. Some of the stuff we've looked at, I'll admit, probably is a little closer to regulatory development, but there's a lot going on in that field. There's stuff at the national level, there's stuff at the Bay program level. We don't want to be in a position where DEQ gets too far ahead of what those programs are doing and we're inconsistent. So we're just kind of seeing what folks think. We are updating our BMP specifications for non-proprietary BMPs. And that has been a slow going process with all of the other items in the program going on. But we hope to get some traction on that later this year. And as folks know, we've got the 2011 BMPs specs that are approved. Those are actually in the VSMP reg. There are 2013 draft ones. DEQ will accept folks to submit those or to use those. And I think that we have found that even though the 2013s are a little newer, might be a little better, they're still not quite where they need to be. And we're looking at what we can do to improve those. And then lastly, we have had legislation through a budget amendment that started in 2018. It was carried forward in 2019 that allows for an expedited plan review in circumstances of land disturbance greater than 100 acres. And there is a $30,000 fee associated with that. To some folks, like solar industry, that might not be a whole lot of money. To others, it probably is pretty significant. But when the legislation as part of the budget came out last year, it was a little vague. It just basically directed that DEQ could accept $30,000 and do an expedited review on stormwater management plans. And I don't think any consideration was given to the fact that we've got VSMP authorities that do plan review. So it raised a lot of questions on our end. The language was changed this year. It does authorize, does not require, but does authorize that a local government can choose to do an expedited plan review for $30,000. So we're going to be sending some information out to our VSMPs for that. All right. I am ready to stop talking for a minute and hear from you guys. So with all of that going on, I'm going to grab my notepad because there will be things that come up that I cannot answer, and I will have to maybe get back with folks or shoot Dan email responses and get with folks. But any questions that you guys have, I will attempt to answer them. Yes, sir.
Everybody can check. There we go.
Thank you. Yes, the last statement about expedited plan review for
Yes, sir.
greater than 100 acres. Have you defined yet what expedited is? What kind of time frame?
It is. It's defined in the budget language as 45 days. But that's 45 governmental review days. And so We have received at DEQ since January of this year about 10 plans under expedited review. To be quite honest, it's a first. We're kind of making it up as we go. But the way that we've been operating is we've been telling folks, first and foremost, please, 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 please give us a heads up that this is coming in, so that we can adjust schedules and workload accordingly. We do not start a review until we get the $30,000 check. And it rises to the top of our list of priorities. Typically, we're turning them around in about 3 or 4 days. Once we send comments back, that time clock stops. So if we send comments on day 4, then it stops at 4. And then once we get the revised plans or submittal back, day 5 starts. So that's how it's working.
I don't mean to take the microphone from everybody else, but I have one other quick question that came up earlier in my thoughts. Some of the smaller municipalities have given the VSMP authority over to DEQ. They don't have in-house capability, but they're finding that things are taking quite a long time to get reviewed for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's lack of coordination between yet another authority having erosion control review, and then the sort of a miscommunication back to DEQ between the two, and plan sets don't match and things like that, and things start taking longer and longer. If a municipality wanted to take back, a small municipality wanted to take back VSMP authority and use a third party to do review, such as the Soil and Water Conservation District, or even could they use a third party engineering company that has people who are plan review qualified?
The biggest thing, they've got to go through the process to adopt an ordinance. And let me give you my phone number directly, because I will gladly give you whatever programs back now. But no, what we would do is we would ask for a pre-meeting with the locality to go through the process. It would require an ordinance adoption. The local government could contract out third party to do plan review and to do inspections, but they do need to make sure that they retain the enforcement of abilities.
Yeah, okay.
That's the big piece.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about updates to other forms like the notice of termination, the SWIP template for single family detached, all that other stuff?
Yeah, so I actually had it in the presentation that I kind of made this one off of. We've updated the NOT form. Again, it's going to look similar to the new registration statement form. It provides a little bit more clarity. Probably the biggest change on that form is the spot where you report your post-development BMPs. And it was kind of funny because I think that part of it is the folks that are filling those forms out typically aren't the technical folks that are like in this room. And we were getting crazy names on BMPs and trying to match them up. I'm sure the VSMP saw it too. So we tried to provide a list of BMP names to use. That was probably the biggest change, other than the way it looks. The other question, single family homes. So we have updated our website, and I didn't put that plug in. We have updated the construction stormwater website. It has all of the old 2014 documents on it, but it also has all of the new 2019 documents on it. You can download the registration statement, the notice of termination, transfer form, all of that. We have updated the SWIP template for single family residential structures. Nothing really changed in there. There was one change, and I'm trying to remember. I think it had to do with the waste container requirement, but that was really it. And then we have also updated that coverage letter so that any single family residential structure that's using that automatic coverage needs to download that new letter that becomes effective July 1.
Yes, getting back to the beginning of your discussion, the notification to homeowners
Yes, sir.
for final stabilization. Would that be, being a residential builder, we close 10 homes a month. And that means every homeowner that we close a lot to has to have a letter stating that their lot is stabilized.
That's correct. What I would recommend, I think that there's a lot of local organizations out there that promote good environmental activity. there might be opportunities to partner up to create some type of outreach document. And if, maybe you have a generic form letter that's with that and you send that out, then, that satisfies that requirement. So I'm not saying it needs to be specific to every, you don't need to develop a final stabilization plan for every home, but you need to make sure that homeowner recognizes, because I think we've all seen it, homes are in that temporary stabilization state and the homeowner says, well, what's all this? I'm going to go and grade my lot and I want it to flow, the drainage to flow this way. And they, do things that might be contrary to getting that final stabilization. So it can be real simple.
But that letter is required for the NOT.
Yes, the letter does not need to be provided with the NOT, a signed certification statement that you did it.
Okay.
Yeah, but you need to retain documentation in your SWIP that it was done.
Very good. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Hi, thank you
Hi.
for presenting today. I'm a highway contractor, so from that perspective, the inspection frequency
Yes.
that was listed early on, was the only part of that changed, the 24 hours versus 48? So
Yep.
so the 10 days, that's nothing new. That's
No, but if what I will say, you say you're a highway contractor. If you work for VDOT, let's say, I mentioned the annual standard inspect program, and VDOT's probably our biggest annual standard inspect holder. And as part of their annual standards inspects, and I'm going to be honest, I don't remember exactly what they've got in there, but they could have said, you know what, our commitment is going to be doing inspections every 3 days, or whatever they choose, as long as it's at least as stringent and in compliance with their regulation and law. And they say, hey, you contractor, you've got to abide by these annual standards and specs, and you're going to be held, that's the contract between the two of you. So, but that language, other than the 24 hours, didn't change.
so they're not required to provide relief if regulation became less burdensome. They don't have to follow that.
So the regulation did not become less burdensome. It would have become more burdensome. And again, what we hold VDOT to would be the annual standard inspects that they have committed to us. When we approve it, we verify that it is at least as stringent as our regulatory requirement.
Two more quick questions. You mentioned localities sometimes have an annual maintenance fee.
Yep.
Can you summarize what counties those are?
I don't know. I know Loudon does. Prince William, Fairfax. Anybody else know other ones? Leesburg has one. A lot of them do. So when folks come in and get their permit coverage, you're paying for that plan review and that initial permit coverage. And what annual maintenance fees allow is the continued cost for program implementation, folks coming on site, doing inspections, wrapping up terminations. And I can probably get you that list. I've got it at the office if you're interested. But yeah, if you want to give me your card, or I can give you mine, you can shoot me a question.
Finally, one last question. Something that's we've been struggling with is staging areas and off-site support facilities. So where they might not fall into the right-of-way, they might be a tiny sliver outside of the right-of-way. Is there any relief mechanisms there where you wouldn't have to go to the other authority, VSMP authority?
Unfortunately not. The regulation speaks to offsites need to be covered, and they can either be covered through the primary permit or a secondary permit. So if you can convince whoever you're doing the work for, if it's VDOT, that you should be covered, or whoever is holding that main permit, that it should be covered, that's your best bet. We've had multiple conversations with VDOT about the offsite situation. We've also had conversations with some of our local governments, specifically in the Hampton Roads area, that are concerned about that because it's perceived as an additional burden. I guess it's not really perceived, but it is an additional, something that they've got to track and monitor. It's just unfortunate. We can't require, let's say VDOT or whoever's holding the contract to include those offsites if they don't have operational control. So they've got to be able to get on and off of those sites and, you know, allow DEQ right of entry and the VSMP, well, I guess DEQ is the VSMP, but in that circumstance, but yeah, it's the operational control is what the really sticking point is.
Hi, Jamie. I have about 3 questions. If you can go back to slide number 15.
Okay, you're getting ready to ask me to do
Okay.
something that is way beyond my, which slide was it?
This is related to the registration statement
Okay,
regarding the areas.
okay. That
So-
was the picture of the registration
Right.
statement? Mhm.
So the question I have is under site information section. It says under item number 4, section 4, do not include the offsite acreage totals in the primary. I understand that.
Okay.
On-site total and estimated disturbed acreage total. So why, how many, I mean,
So on this form here,
Yeah.
I didn't think I'd get to use the laser. Let's see. All right, so this is gonna be your total.
correct,
That's gonna be the primary activity.
right?
That's gonna be just your total offsite. So,
I-
so if you've got 5 offsite facilities that are a sum total of 5 acres, that would be what was reported there. And then our database is doing the automatic calculation behind the
But the
numbers.
problem is you also continue saying on-site total and estimated disturbed area. So you are saying you don't want to include that area into the on-site total?
No, I don't think so. Let me get back to you on that because we made changes. There's been some back and forth on this. So I don't want to direct you wrong, Raj, but I'll
Okay,
double check
that's
on
fine,
that.
because why I'm saying is, if you look at the total, it says total land area of development, including entire area to be disturbed as approved in the stormwater management plan.
Mhm.
So offsite area will be part of the stormwater management plan. So I'm a little bit confused in the instructions. for
Yeah,
What it says.
And I think that that question has come up before.
Okay.
So, yes, sir. Ryan.
The
Wait, Raj, wait. Ryan, did you want to speak to that?
Their area of development.
Uh-huh.
But I think normally, I mean, at least the way we've understood it is that the offsite support activities should not be included in the stormwater plan because it's a temporary activity and it goes back to existing conditions.
Correct. It's the
So-
stormwater, it's the ENS plan is, I
Right.
think, what,
So I guess, and I don't know if that, I guess that ties into my question, or maybe it, well, go ahead.
the offsite is sometimes you have a development, and you got to make offsite improvement for access road, for example.
okay. So I
That-
wouldn't consider that an offsite. I'm considering offsite the support activities. Let's say you've got to have some lay down yards or, other areas where there's going to be staging associated with the construction. I would consider offsite that you're speaking of, like utility improvements or road improvements. Those would be the total.
Well, for example, you have a development going on, residential development. As
Mhm.
part of the residential development, they may have to widen the road in the VDOT right of way.
Yep.
So do you consider the area in the VDOT right of way as offsite or onsite?
No, it's offsite. It's on site. So,
It's onsite?
and well, the only caveat I'll say is if the developer doing the residential development is taking on the responsibility for widening that road to VDOT standards, and that's part of the total project, then they report that as primary area to be disturbed or estimated area to be disturbed. In the situation in which maybe there is utility work or VDOT's going to actually come out and do the road widening, then that would need to be covered under a separate permit. But that offsite, as we define it, is the support activities of staging and lay down yards and so forth. But if it's actually, there's going to be that change in land cover associated with the site, that's where it gets pulled in.
Okay, thank you. And,
Uh-oh. I hit a nerve. I see the highway contractor's hands going up.
The next thing is the availability of credit. Availability
Yeah.
of nutrient credits. you are saying under the registration statement, you added that.
Yep.
Availability of credit. But you know, when they get the availability of credit letter, they have set time limit,
Mhm.
maybe 45 days from the date or 60 days from the date.
Yep.
And they sell them too after that.
Yep.
Okay, if purchase doesn't go through, they sell it. So what is the point of just getting a availability of credit at the time of registration statement and not actually buying the credit?
So the expectation is that, you know, whatever has to be done is done prior to land disturbance. And we actually try to push the nutrient credit purchase the affidavit of sale with registration statements. That was actually in the proposed reg that went out for public comment. We got a lot of pushback, quite frankly, from some of the development and consulting community. And their concern was that changes along the way change what the ultimate purchase is. So what we said is for permit only, you know, for permit termination, we'll require the affidavit of sale because it'll be a complete package of exactly what was purchased instead of at registration statement. And typically, I'm not sure how VSMP authorities are doing this, but DEQ requires the registration statement to come in with the plan submittal. And just like, you know, anything else, that by that fifth iteration of that plan, limits of development or disturbance have changed. And so that ultimately is going to change what your purchase requirement is. So we said that a fair middle ground is to show us you've got some commitment from the banker, and you know, following that, your point is well taken, Raj. But following that, we would require the affidavit at the end of the process. Yeah. And yeah, and I'm not going to tell you to stop doing that. And this is something that our regulated community probably doesn't like, and I'm going to say it anyway. So you're dealing with DEQ and you're dealing with 95 local governments that all do things a little differently. They have approved programs. They submitted their programs to DEQ. They submitted their, you know, ordinance packages. We approved their programs, and we really default to them to make sure that they're doing what they've got to do to implement that program, and try not to dictate the process along the way. I mean, there's certainly big things that that we try to ensure consistency on, but they are their own authorities, and we will work with them one-on-one to resolve issues as need be, but we don't want to step on those toes.
One more question is, can you go over on the extension of approvals to address housing crisis, the vesting?
Yes. Yep.
That's important because plans like that,
Mhm.
and how do you? And
Sure. So what Raj is referring to has to do with section 15.2 of the Code of Virginia. And I'll back up a little bit further. So the old stormwater development, post-development criteria. In the stormwater management regulation, there are two ways in which you can use that old criteria. One is to be grandfathered, and there are specific requirements you got to meet to be grandfathered, one of which was you didn't have a permit prior to July 1, 2014, and you had to start construction before July 1, 2019. And then you had to have plans and zoning and, you know, those equivalent type of plans proffered before July 1, 2012, I believe the date was. And then there's a second category that probably more people are familiar with, and we call it in the regulatory world, projects under time limits on applicability. And those are the ones that had the 10 years, so they've got till 2024 to get under construction. So one of the comments we hear quite often is, well, we should be grandfathered because under 15.2 of the Code of Virginia, they said because of the housing crisis, these old plans were grandfathered and you didn't have to come back in and get an extension. Well, when the new stormwater management regulations were developed and approved in 2011, there was a intentional decision to not link grandfathering under the housing crisis to any old criteria for stormwater management. That was something that DCR made a decision on. They had their reasons, I suppose, but that is how it's set up. It's in the regulatory development documents from 2011. And it is our position that has to do, recognizing that stormwater management and zoning are intertwined because it's your final site design. But at the end of the day, they are distinct plans. They are not related as far as the housing crisis is concerned. So just because you're grandfathered under the Housing Crisis Act does not grandfather you under the stormwater management requirements. We hear it all the time too. So,
So I had a question on this slide here too. So the total land area of development, let's say you had a master planned community where you have 50 acres.
Yep.
And you're going in for section 1 and you're disturbing, let's just say 5 acres of it.
Mhm.
You finish that out and you're going in for a modification to go in for your next section. Say you're doing 10 acres now.
Mhm.
Would you put under the primary estimate, would you put the 10 acres or would you then put 15?
15.
So now if you've already completed the first section and that 5 is no longer being disturbed,
In the world of DEQ stormwater management, you never, except for the one exception I talked about, you never decrease acreage. The total area disturbed associated with that project is now 15 because you disturbed, you stabilized, now you're moving to your next area to disturb. So total land disturbance is increasing.
so would that mean as we move further in the project, that would bump up for those localities that do the maintenance fee? If we bump up our acreage, would we then, even though we're only disturbing a 10-acre portion, but as
Correct.
we're further in our site, would we then have to pay higher maintenance fees?
If you trigger the threshold, yes. Yep.
Okay.
And that's also gonna come into play. So if you come in at the next level, then you've got group the categories, right? Groups.
Right.
And so if your land disturbance then transfers from the bottom tier to the next tier, there's fees associated with that. So the best thing that I can say, because all of this does get a little confusing, is have the conversation with your VSMP authority, put a cover letter on it, make it clear this is what we're doing. We're modifying our permit to go from this to this.
Would you be able to do separate permits for each phase or would it all have to be on one?
You can certainly do separate permits for each phase. You'd have to have your master stormwater plan, but that master stormwater plan can cover multiple permits.
Thank you.
Jimmy, you know all the answers. I don't know why you're raising your hand.
I just want to know what are the options as far as local actions when registration statements are late or they don't have complete information by the July 1 date?
This is a tough question. And the reason that it's tough is a variety of issues. So first I mentioned that because of some other things going on at the agency, we got delayed in getting that permit approved ultimately. And as most of you know, we have a draft registration statement for 2019 that's been on the streets. We've replaced that with the final one now. We are accepting the draft registration statement. We've encouraged local governments to accept it, but they certainly can require the final if they so choose. But because we were so late in the game, I am not going to get hung up on the DEQ side if we get late registration statements. If they get me something by July 1 and it's complete, that's really, quite frankly, my focus. We've had some folks say, well, why do I have to give you something May 1st when, that doesn't even expire till July? Well, like I said, we've got 6,000 of these that we are processing. So the more we can get processed, the better. But I wouldn't get too hung up at DEQ on a late registration statement. I think the bigger piece is just making sure it's complete.
After July 1.
Oh, after July 1, they are technically, number one, if they're doing land disturbance, they are operating without a permit. Right? So, I mean, that's if they don't submit the registration statement before July 1, then that means obviously we haven't processed a coverage letter for them. So, so that's a pretty big deal. And that's one of the things I'm sure the VSMP authorities might be wondering about. We're going to have a certain number of 2014 operators that do not come in and get reissuance for whatever reason. You know, we've tried to put the word on the street. We've tried to reach out to folks and make sure folks know about the reissuance. We've told the VSMP authorities, make sure folks know about the reissuance. So I think that the challenge we have in front of us is to get the paperwork processed and then see what's left. What, you know, we can do some searches in the database to see who got coverage under 2019 and who didn't, you know, and then we can start going out to those sites and contacting those operators and find out what's going on. But ultimately, if they don't submit a registration statement by July 1, or they submit it after July 1 and they're doing land disturbance, and they're operating without a permit.
Would you look at it differently if they've submitted it, but they just haven't gotten the problems worked out on it yet?
If in good faith effort, they are continuing to work with the VSMP authority to get all of the items resolved, that doesn't concern me. If they submit a registration statement and the VSMP authority contacts them and says, hey, your operator name's wrong, or we've got this concern or issue, and they are crickets and they refuse to provide the information, then that is not, I think that we've got every right at that point to consider it not complete and expired on July 1.
And just last question, related to maintenance fees, is that kind of a local issue if they are late, as opposed to affecting this process?
Can you expand on that, Jimmy? I don't think I followed you.
Just if they are late on their 2019 maintenance fees to us, I know you guys are probably gonna not issue based on that,
Right.
as far as I knew, but
Yep.
is that kind of a local decision as far as the way we treat that?
So what I would say first, I didn't mention that, so that's a good plug. In order to get reissuance, there is no fee, but you do have to be current on your maintenance fees. So as we reissue permits at DEQ, we are checking our outstanding fee list, and we're contacting folks. We have tried to contact them prior, but we were contacting folks and saying, hey, we're not issuing permit until we get our money for last year. If you don't pay us, you're not getting your permit by July 1, you know. The regulation, I believe, states specifically that you should not reapply if there's outstanding balances. Or excuse me, you should not reissue if there's outstanding balances. That's going to be at the discretion of the VSMP authority. You know, unfortunately, you know, sometimes we've got to make judgment calls in this world and fight the battles that really matter.
Just two small questions.
Yes, sir.
I heard you mention that the BMP standards are going to be, or you're looking at updating those.
Yep.
So that probably pings the next one is the 2013 draft stormwater management draft standards. Is it ever going to become a 2020 stormwater management handbook, or?
That's the goal. I mean, I can't say it's going to happen in 2020, but we've got the draft handbook that's out there. And what's challenging is that our VSMP handbook, VRM, and specs are listed by date in the regulation. So without a regulatory change, we can't promulgate that, you know, say these are the final and move forward. We have toyed with the idea of, is there a way to pull those out of the regulation so that the agency can update as needed? Some folks think that that's a great idea. Some folks say, well, we don't want DEQ going around monkeying and approving things without going through a regulatory process. So, you know, there's pros and cons. I would say that in addition to updating the specs, once that's done, we're going to start hitting on the handbook. So stay tuned. Probably not as quick as everyone in this room would like, but it's definitely on the list.
And secondly, are we going to get a copy? Can we get a copy of the your PowerPoint?
Absolutely.
Great, thanks.
And you had a question. Did you want to follow up? I didn't want to forget you.
What the heck? So back to the disturbed acreage.
Yes.
Slide. Follow up from the gentleman in the front. For the offsite estimated areas to be disturbed. So again, the support facilities, your staging areas, tiny little slivers where you might put some concrete barrier or something like that. If those are below the 1 acre threshold,
Permit is required
and why is that?
because it's part of the overall plan, the whole development.
Okay. Wow.
And I will say that
Now,
I
when
don't
you
think
pull
that
permit, is that
what's that?
when you pull that small permit, do you have to include the VDOT? No.
No, but you would want to identify that it's associated.
Okay.
That would be my recommendation, because otherwise the VSMP authority is going to say, you don't need a permit, you're 0.25 acres. And I would, I defer to our VSMP authorities. I don't know if y'all have certain things you like to see from folks. We always say highlight, mark, red, do whatever to bring attention to the fact that this is, a little different than just a normal registration statement.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I did go to 10:30. I can't believe that.
It was good timing. Okay, no other questions? Thank you, Jamie.
Yep.